It's the week ending Friday the 13th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen multiple fatalities after a London-bound passenger plane crashed after takeoff in India, the Chancellor announcing more funds for the NHS and Defence in her spending review, and the death of Beach Boys singer-songwriter Brian Wilson at the age of 82. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that pass under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's our new regular lineup of Harriet, Marsden, Jamie Timson and Felicity Capon. Chaps, your favourite Beach Boys song?
Wouldn't it be nice?
Oh, come on. You can't take, the only one that people know.
Why not? It's incredible. It's an absolute banger, and it's wistful, it's gorgeous. Why would that not be a favourite?
Felicity, come on. You must have a second favourite Beach Boys song. Good Vibration, Surfing USA?
Okay, I'm thinking of the wrong band. I like Sleepy Jean. Is that the Monkees?
That's the Monkees. Jamie?
I'm a big Love Actually fan, so I'm a God Only Knows guy.
Okay, right, fine. Can I just say, if the death of Brian Wilson has inspired you to check out Beach Boys albums, can I just recommend you to Sunflower? Everyone goes to Pet Sounds. My controversial hot take, Sunflower's better. Jamie, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week saw the end of the beautiful game, but not as we know it.
We got our first penalty. 36 seconds into the game changer. Flo tucking it away, putting us 1-0 up. Shushing the SDS lot on the side. Then again, KG Affair. They finally work a bit of space. It's a good shot. Maybe Montel switched off a little bit. Gave him too much space, allowed him to get a shot off. Pulled him back into the game.
YouTuber TBJZL, aka Tobit John Brown, sharing his thoughts in his video, What Really Happened at Baller League, about what really happened at Baller League. But Jamie, what is Baller League? What's the story?
Oh, great question. You going to watch the game tonight, Ollie?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, it was a tough one. Oh, we were in it for a penny and it was difficult.
Absolutely. I do like in it for a penny.
So it is football, but what is it?
Last night. So it's tonight as we record it, but it's last night when this goes out. A little bit a look behind the curtain there of podcast magic. It was the final of the Baller League, which is the... Oh, well, to be fair, it is football. It's 6-on-6. The final was played at the Copper Box near the O2.
Yes, London's glamorous Stratford, yeah.
Absolutely. And so it's 6-on-6, but the kind of the joy of it, or the idea behind it, is that because it's a smaller sided game, there's more focus on skills and less focus on tactics. The kind of the main appeal, I would say, to it is that, and that's why we heard from Tobe Jizzle, and he's involved in one of the teams. It's influencers. That's the main thing. It's like we've seen influencers in boxing through KSI and Jake Paul and the Misfits, and now they're taking on football. I think it's... Obviously, there are a lot of people, quite po-faced, saying how bad this is for the sport and how it's not really football, and what enjoyment can you get from watching players that aren't... I mean, all of the players are not... some of them have played professionally, but they're not exactly at the top level. It's not really aimed at the kind of traditional football-going fan. It's more aimed at the people that sit online and want to watch clips of it. It's very fast-paced. There's lots of kind of interesting rule changes that are meant to get people involved. And it's really aimed at younger people, a younger generation.
Yeah, your generation, Felicity, that you speak to through the Week Junior, potentially, when they're a few years older. Do you think it'll work?
I admire it to some extent because it's trying to disrupt the game of football, which I guess has been tried before with the Masters League, and maybe street football was turned into a FIFA PlayStation game, wasn't it, for a while? But it is for young people, YouTubers, and those with short attention spans, basically. And you're kind of seeing that across lots of cultural things at the moment, that things are getting shortened and more easily packaged for a YouTube online audience. I think it's very interesting. I like that it's kind of scrappy and there's, it's the underdogs. I like the idea of kind of ripping up the rule book, and in some ways it feels like a bit of a backlash. When I was growing up, football was Wayne Rooney slagging off the fans and then going to sleep with a prostitute, and John Terry and all these bad boys and all that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden it was like the squeaky clean England squad with their inflatable
Right,
unicorns.
because the England
Lots
squad
of-
are so squeaky clean, Felicity. Come on.
But, you know, in terms of like more rules, more kind of sanitized version of the game. And this seems like a backlash to that, which makes me laugh in a way.
Harriet, you're a football fan. Do you think it could ever replace football?
I don't think it's a question of replacing football so much as responding to a current cultural reality. Like, there are advantages and disadvantages to this. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that it's scrappy, it's pacey, it's really fast, it's very...
Can you just explain what that is when you say pacey? It's literally like 20-minute halves or something?
Yeah, I think is it not 30 minutes total?
Yeah, so 15 minutes per half.
15-minute
Okay,
halves
right.
with 30-minute totals and no corners. There is still VAR, but only if it's like on the basis of appeal, so kind of like tennis. But the whole format is designed to highlight individuals. So it's less team driven. It's less about like partisanship in terms of your team and your tribal nature of like where the players are from or who they've played for a long time. There are also obviously disadvantages in terms of it being quite chaotic to watch as well. There's also an argument that it kind of prioritizes branding over skill and that kind of individual personality driven marketability. I mean, there are things to like about it and things to be nervous about it, but in terms of whether or not it will replace football, it is responding to, I think, some quite legitimate complaints about modern football now. Firstly, in terms of the accessibility, like the price point for a football match is now so high with the spiraling cost of ticket prices that does keep so many fans out of the stadiums. Also, sport is built on a model like the broadcasting rights model where now everybody has a mobile phone and that's how they want to consume content. That is a reality. So I think in terms of the future, it is part of a new kind of way of consuming culture that is physical and online at the same time. So there's like a mixture of sport, but also tech, influencer culture, and new media as well.
But what's in it, Jamie, for the viewers, for the fans?
As with football, as we know it, there are kind of two like groups of people. There's the people that go for the entertainment and pay £15. And I think part of that is, like Harriet says, it's cheaper, and I think part of the appeal is
actually the price of a Pret baguette these days.
It's a penny. It's more than a penny. And so I think the appeal of being there is actually being up close to their influencers. So kind of the big names that have been involved is KSI is the league president, Angry Ginge, who's a quite famous streamer.
Mr. Jizz,
the manager.
You mentioned earlier.
Yeah, he's a manager. The Sidemen in general, who are like a kind of massive British YouTube group, they're involved quite heavily in it. For younger people and people who are fans of the influencers, but actually getting to be that close to and enjoying their personality. And I've watched a couple of these games, and the personality comes through in spades. You know, there are people like celebrating, dancing. It's like Ian Wright's involved in one of the teams, and he had a massive set to at the end with one of the players. It's a bit like the entertainment value that I guess people get from UFC and stuff like that.
Yes.
Is that the enjoyment comes from seeing the personalities of the players involved. In terms of whether it's going to take over, I mean, people had a lot of negative and kind of po-faced things to say about T20 cricket, and that's almost completely replaced the other forms of cricket.
Yeah, okay, but on that though, I mean, Felicity, T20 cricket is world-class cricketers playing. They're just playing in a different format. But this, as Jamie was just saying, are people who aren't even, you know, anywhere near the Premier League, right? They're all people who were in the Premier League 30 years ago. So for an entertainment value, is there a comparison there? It sounds more like kind of WWE to me.
I don't think there's any comparison. I don't think this is any kind of threat to football. I think it's completely different. I think it will probably be a flash in the pan. I don't think it will last. I don't think it's relevant really to the game of football, which, you know.
But it is relevant to modern culture, though. It is relevant to people under 30. Like, that's the difference.
For now, but whether it will last or not remains to be seen, I think.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that it could well be a flash in the pan. I think that streaming is not a flash in the pan. I think streaming is, like it or not, the new and future reality of consumption of sport. There was a rumour, I think, or a source that said that Sky had purchased the broadcast rights of this for £25 million. There is people thinking that this is going to be the future of how people consume football, because people are not watching football in the way that they used to. So like it or not, there is a new reality of how people consume the sport.
I think what's most likely to happen is that football will start aping some of the good bits of the Baller League and take on some of the things that the Baller League are doing as a way of appealing to younger people.
Okay, so like what? What could you actually see FIFA or the FA say, yes, we need to do that?
I mean, definitely not necessarily any of the rules or the football itself, but in terms of the presentation, I can imagine more kind of pitch side stuff, more interviews, more allowing the players to have more of a say over their personal brand in terms of the presentation of when you watch the game.
What does that mean? Because you've all used this phrase, your personal brand. What does that to normal people? What does that mean?
I mean, and a good example is like Ronaldo, right? He's undoubtedly probably the biggest sportsman in the world, and he has the biggest amount of followers on all different social media platforms. He now has personal fans who follow him no matter what team he plays for, and it doesn't matter to them what club it is. So in the old days, you used to be a football fan, you used to be a fan of a football club, right? Now what's happening is people are becoming fans of just the individual players.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest takeaway for me when I was reading about this league, is whether or not you agree with how it does things, or whether or not you think that there are benefits to things that could be taken away from it. I think the reality is that the Premier League in particular, but modern football more broadly, has kind of failed its audience. Like, there are, I think, a lot of legitimate complaints about ticket pricing, about the oversaturation of the calendar. Like, the players are exhausted by all the matches they have to play. Injuries are on the rise. Like, there's kind of a content saturation happening with massive clubs trying to put out, or massive like things like FIFA trying to get as much out of the players as possible. And then also like VAR, like all of the delays of VAR are just a nightmare. Like, there's a very kind of now risk averse style of play too that's kind of become the norm in the Premier League in particular. Like, it was a really boring season. So I do think that whatever traditional football wants to take or leave from the Baller League, what they should be thinking about is what they're doing wrong.
Felicity.
My brother-in-law is an Arsenal fan, and he said it was not a boring season at all, just to push back on that. And also,
well, that sounds authoritative.
I think a lot of people would disagree.
PSG won the Champions League this year, and I think that was widely seen as a victory for football against the kind of growing accusations of sports washing being a real problem in football. They brought in loads of younger players and they focused on playing more as a team. And actually, I think people were saying that, you know, for all this talk about it's about personalities and online, I think maybe that's an example of that's actually not the case. And when you have a group of footballers who are playing as a team and then win the Champions League in a really good game, it shows that I still just don't think that there is any way that the Baller League is going to compete with football as we know it. But I do think the idea of changing the game and bringing in rules to kind of like spice it up is a really interesting one, because if you look at rugby's had its like most exciting season of play ever, and rugby is constantly changing the rules to make it faster, and like all the top leagues have had their highest try scoring seasons like ever. And that, I mean, they're all quite small rules that they're changing, but they are constantly changing the rules all the time, and you could argue that is making rugby more interesting. So does football need to adopt from the Baller League that it's introducing, you know, smaller rules to keep it more lively?
And also, where are the women, Jamie? You know, someone who doesn't particularly watch sport but is aware of trends. You know, all everyone's talked about for the last 10 years is that women's football is coming out the shadows and it's being taken more seriously. And like, you have this new league with this very hyper-masculine name, the Baller League. And, I mean, there are women to be seen in terms of, you know, Maya Jama runs a team and stuff. But where are the women on the pitch?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Alicia Lehman, who's a female footballer, but again has a very big personal brand. She's involved, same as Maya Jama. But I agree. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Baller League moved on to including, female footballers at a different time. There's actually a kind of similar league in Spain called the Kings League. It's less kind of influencer based, but it was started up by a former footballer, and I think it'd be more likely that they would have women's teams over there. So I mean, it's growing as a concept to kind of across Europe. I think Felicity's point about the rugby is really interesting. I think that probably the main difference is that the Baller League is things like we're going to reduce the players immediately, whereas rugby is quite a technical sport. I kind of think there's a very easy, very old-fashioned way of looking at this as like a disruption that is like completely pointless. But I certainly, with the way that the Misfits have ended up selling out huge arenas for boxing. I think that football has a perfectly good space for disruption in this way.
Yeah, I'm just fascinated by the idea, really, that you can have parallel events going on, one being reported by the mainstream media and one which is massive on social media and no one really talks about it elsewhere. But if you know, you know.
That's sort of true of kind of every cultural
all internet
space
culture
now.
Yeah.
There's such a growing division between what's being talked about in traditional media outlets and how younger people are actually consuming or following any news and content, which is primarily via YouTube and TikTok.
Back of the net. Up next, how many years should you have stayed in a country before you can become a citizen? That's after this. Okay, Felicity, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's a simple yes or no answer, Olly.
His journey was similar to that of thousands of other young people who flee Africa to reach Europe. Lamin was only 15 when he left the Gambia.
We were nearly 150 people on board. We were all seated like this in rows, squeezed in like sardines. There were women with newborn babies. There were no life vests. And at one point the boat began taking on water and we were scared. You can't describe moments like that. It was difficult.
The boat was rescued and Lamin was taken to Sicily.
The words of Lanin, a migrant living in Italy, speaking to France 24 on Monday. Felicity, what's been happening?
Italy has held a referendum on whether or not to make it easier for immigrants to gain citizenship, but it failed due to a low turnout. So it was held over 2 days, ending on Monday, just gone. And only about 30% of eligible voters turned out, and it needed a 50% threshold to be met for the vote to pass.
Is that the case with all referenda in Italy? You need to get to a 50% threshold, do you?
Yes, yeah, and they have quite a few. They have quite a lot. And voters were basically asked whether non-EU migrants should be allowed to apply for Italian citizenship after just 5 years of continuous residency instead of 10. And then there were like 4 other questions on labour laws as well. But basically, not enough people turned out to vote, and so it was invalid.
So let's deal with the kind of apathy later, if you like. Let's take the first bit first, which is the question at hand. Should migrants be able to have citizenship of a country after residency of 5 years? That doesn't feel like a question that Giorgia Meloni would have put to the public. So how did it end up being a referendum at all?
It was a citizens' initiative which gained support from parties on the left and trade unions. 500,000 signatures are required to call a referendum, which they met, and then it was kind of, taken on by these parties on the left. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, no surprises, she urged a boycott. And there's also been accusations from the left that there wasn't that much publicity surrounding it. So, not enough people knew about it. But there was enough publicity that the actual Prime Minister said, I think she went to a polling station but didn't cast a vote and made it quite clear that she was urging a boycott, which it seems as though Italians heeded the call and, followed her lead and did not go for it.
Well, just on that, this is a bit deep in the weeds, but why would a boycott be better than just voting no if you don't want to extend the...
I think some people see them as akin to one another. If you vote, I guess you're actually giving the referendum legitimacy because you'll reach the threshold, right? If you don't...
Oh, right. So she was saying, I don't believe we should even be asking this question.
No, it hasn't. And also, if the threshold had been reached and they'd voted to loosen these immigration laws, it would have been binding. So it actually would have bypassed Meloni and her government and would have become law, which you could argue is not the most democratic way things should be done.
Okay, so not necessarily actually then, Harriet, about apathy at all. Potentially people just fed up of referenda, they want a government who can govern.
Yeah, this is definitely a reflection of the kind of the increasing use of and politicization of referendums in Italy. The key flaw in a referendum with a minimum quota is that if you're opposed to it, you're actually safer staying home than you are going to vote against it and contributing to that quota. So it's not necessarily to do with apathy. And people are also less and less minded to turn up because there's been such an increase in referendums as a reaction to the crisis in the Italian party system anyway. It's worth not conflating not turning up with apathy.
I think the fact that A, they voted in Meloni as Prime Minister, who is obviously anti-immigration, and then B, they haven't turned up. So I think you can also read it as a sign that they don't want people to gain
that's definitely
after 5 years.
That's definitely fair. And if you take as the premise that the people who did turn up to vote were kind of centrists or left-leaning people, the fact that they backed the work-related reforms, but they rejected the reform that would have cut down on the wait time to apply for citizenship is actually quite a bad result for the Italian progressives that pushed for this referendum in the first place, because it's a sign that part of their own electorate and part of their own ideologically minded people actually oppose a more liberal citizenship law. So it's kind of a warning for the left-wing or centrist and left-wing coalition with the trade unions that sort of thought that people on their side would come out and back this. So of all the people that voted, between 86 and 88% of them backed the first 4 questions to do with work-related reforms, but only 65% voted in favour of the citizenship one. So as Felicity was saying, that is actually not reflective of a population that is wanting a more liberal immigration system.
Is it a question of sort of liberal and conservative, though, Jamie? Because Italy, for a long time, has been very protective over a lot of its national characteristics, its food, its language, its culture. And when you're talking about citizenship, you're not talking about rights to do that much, really. You can still work there and pay tax as a migrant or as the child of a migrant. It's almost just the sense of your personal self as a citizen that's at stake. And they've long had this rule that you need to be there for 10 years. So in a way, regardless of your political position, what was the argument that it needed to be changed?
It was quite a simple argument in that they're saying basically that these people need to be able to be seen as Italian. So the example that actually the BBC interviewed someone was they'd lived in Italy their whole life, right? So they'd been there since they were born. He was 39 years old, and his parents had moved there, but he'd never got citizenship because his parents weren't born in Italy.
Yeah, and they need to have been working for 10 years continuously, don't they? That's the other thing.
Yeah. And so he basically was saying, like, I am Italian, I speak Italian, I know the culture, I know everything. But it is effectively, his argument was that it was racism that was keeping him from being a citizen.
But how's he disenfranchised as not being a citizen? He can't vote, for example.
Yeah, and also, and I think that it makes living there a lot harder in terms of work and your access to things like welfare and things like that. I was actually in Italy for 3 weeks last month, and it was amazing how little because this was, obviously it was in the build up to the referendum. It was amazing how little information there was out there about the referendum. Rai Uno, which is the TV broadcaster, had almost a complete blackout on the referendum, and that their state owned. So it was definitely a case that Meloni didn't want to legitimise it. I think what's interesting about referendums in Italy in general is that they are being heavily politicised. I don't mind the concept. I mean, I know Felicity said that she didn't think it was very democratic. I don't mind the idea of a referendum if they're repealing the laws, but I think you probably can't have a parliament alongside it because it makes it very confusing. Somewhere like Switzerland, that have a hell of a lot of referendums, they actually don't have their laws being made by parliament. Their laws are made by referendums, and I actually think that's kind of a better system than the one that exists in Italy.
Also, I guess it's a case of who gets to vote, Felicity. So in this case, as I was suggesting, the people who would be most affected by this, like the guy that Jamie was talking about, wouldn't have been able to vote in the referendum about them.
Yeah, but that's fair enough, really. I mean, I don't think it's anything to do with apathy. I can see the frustration of the Italian people, really. I think 5 years, to claim you're a citizen after 5 years is kind of mad. I could live anywhere for 5 years. I definitely would not feel like I was a citizen of that country. I think it's more the sense that it doesn't actually take 10 years at the moment. It takes a lot longer because it's such a slow process that you can be waiting, years and years and years. So actually, if they made it 10 years and it was actually 10 years. But I mean, coming back to the point of Giorgia Meloni and whether this is democratic, this is a resounding victory for her. I just don't buy the argument that not enough people knew about the referendum, so didn't take part. They voted in Meloni in quite an emphatic way. They don't need another vote on immigration. It's quite clear what Meloni stands for. Anyone who doesn't know, she is, very, very traditional values, Christian. There was an unlikely club hit inspired by her, which is all like, Meloni, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a Christian. And so it's not ambiguous as to what she stands for. She's always said she was going to clamp down on immigration. And that election was only in 2022, so not that long ago. I feel like the Italian people have already made it quite clear how they feel about this issue, and they didn't need a referendum to say it all again.
To be clear, though, the referendums weren't connected to Meloni in any way. Like, they were about things that happened in the Renzi era. They were reforms to laws that predated Meloni. Although it was tried to be painted as a litmus test on her government, the actual referendums themselves were not to do with any policies that she had enacted. As actually, I learned a new word for this today. I learned the word abrogative. So this was an abrogative referendum. So they're really weird because they only take away words from the existing wording of the laws. So you have either a law or a policy or like a kind of, it is what it is, which in this case, they all predated Maloney. And then you're asked whether you would take away words from the existing wording. So that is when we say that they're voting on like reforms, they're not, it's just a slight, like we need to slightly kind of bear in mind that we're only saying that people were asked whether or not to take things out rather than to change them and add things in. So abrogative is a fun word that I learned for this podcast. Good.
I'm sure many people will be bringing that into their pub conversations this evening. Felicity, I mean, the issue with Italy specifically, I guess, is that like many other European countries, it has an ageing population and therefore requires some migrant workers. And alongside that, a resurgent nationalism. But I suppose maybe what's different about Italy is they really are having a huge amount of migrants turning up, coming through Africa and the rest of it. You know, we have this talked about as a political issue here in the UK, but the numbers coming to Italy are far, far greater. Yeah, they've had, I think, over 1 million immigrants since 2013. And alongside that, they've had 28,000 deaths. So people dying, you know, in horrendous conditions trying to reach Italy. And you're right, Italy has the oldest population in the EU. The median age is 48.4 years and the smallest share of children under 15. So there is definitely an issue at stake and an issue to solve. But whether immigration is the answer to the economic problems is obviously something that is, you know, very controversial and very divisive. And in terms of, you know, saying that economies are dependent on immigration, I mean, lots of Western societies have high immigration. Their economies aren't doing so well at the moment. So, yeah, it's a very difficult problem that Italy is grappling with. But Maloney, and she's done lots of things to try and combat immigration. I mean, certainly she is trying to give more money to Northern African countries to stem the tide of them coming over in the first place, and also sending them to Albania to be processed in Albania, which, interestingly enough, Keir Starmer was very interested. He went over to visit Maloney to get some tips on that. And I think generally she is seen as someone who is on the right, but has a lot of respectability around her that, you know, people like Keir Starmer don't have a problem with seeing to go in and consult her on things. So she's a very interesting character in that she is kind of hardline on this, but she's managing to make it quite a palatable, respectable issue at the same time. I mentor a Eritrean kid who came over on a small boat to the UK and came up through Italy, and he was saying that once he told them that he didn't want to stay in Italy, they basically kind of paid him to leave Italy. So he arrived through Lampedusa and then into Sicily, and then once he was like, I'm going to keep going, they basically gave him like free access to move through and out of Italy. So I think a lot of the policies that maybe they say that they're trying to enact or whatever is actually, I mean, the EU's immigration policy now is kind of screwed, to use an advisor term, and I think that certainly, as Felicity's hinting at, they're going to have real thoughts about what they do about the influx of people. But with the case of Italy, what I find very strange, and I think bears talking about, is that at the same time as Maloney has been enacting all of these incredibly hardline stances on immigration, and some of them palatable, some of them less so. Like, it's fair to say a lot of people do not find Giorgia Maloney that palatable. She's very allied with the MAGA movement in the US, and she's extremely divisive. But at the same time, Italy is also perpetuating these schemes where they're trying to entice people to move there. Like, you see it on your social media every day. Oh, this village in Italy basically has no people. Please come, we'll give you a house for free. Come for €2, buy a property. I don't see that on my social media feed. Maybe they want you. Maybe. But this is what I'm saying. It's like, who does it want? Because Italy is absolutely desperate for people to move into a lot of its dying villages. Regardless, Felicity, of what this story tells us about referenda in Italy, do you think Brexit basically killed the referendum in the UK? I mean, I don't hear anyone saying let's have another referendum about anything. I think compared to a lot of other countries, the UK is quite good at only having them when they're absolutely necessary. I mean, you could
argue that wasn't absolutely necessary. But we do have
but governments were drag kicking and screaming to promise it.
Yes. But we have far fewer than other countries, I think, across the world, actually. And I think referendum generally are on the rise globally. 600 since the 1970s, and they've really shut up since the 1990s.
But we had one. We had one before the 2016 one. We did. We had one on alternative voting.
No, I'm not saying we don't have them. I just think we have far fewer than other countries who are doing it all the time. And I think that's probably quite wise that we only bring them out every now and again.
Come to Scotland. Come to Scotland, Ollie. There's a fair few people who want a referendum up here.
I think it's interesting with referendums because it really, when I was reading about various noteworthy ones around the world, I really changed my mind on whether I like referendums based on the issue that comes up. So when I think about Brexit, I just think, well, that was just like an appalling decision by David Cameron and a real like abdication of like responsibility. And then when I think about Chile, where I lived for a year, their 1988 referendum got rid of Pinochet, who was a dictator who had been in power for nearly 17 years, peacefully in this amazing campaign. And the No campaign emphatically won and got rid of a dictator. So then I like immediately changed my mind. I'm like, oh, referendums are amazing.
Okay, I'm ending that conversation like David Cameron walking through the Downing Street door. Doobie-doobie-doo. Up next, it's not just K-pop, it's the increasing global reach of South Korean culture. That's after this. Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
South Korea takes a bow.
And the Tony Award goes to Maybe Happy Ending.
Lin-Manuel Miranda presenting Maybe Happy Ending with the Best Musical Award at this year's Tonys. What's the story, Harriet, beyond that? Popular show wins prize.
Well, the story is that this is an original South Korean musical. So Maybe Happy Ending actually debuted in South Korea nearly 10 years ago and transferred to Broadway in 2024. And it was written by a South Korean lyricist called Hue Park and an American composer, Will Aronson. So they also won the Tony for Best Original Score and Best Book of a Musical. So this is also the first Tony for any South Korean. So that now means that South Koreans have won the 4 biggest prizes in US entertainment. So that's the Tonys, Oscars, Emmys, and Grammys.
Just remind us, Parasite was the Oscars, wasn't it?
Parasite was the Oscars. Squid Game won Emmys and a whole bunch of other things. And A Soprano, I think in the 1990s, won a Grammy. And then last year, Han Kang became the first Korean to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. So it's a really good time to shine a spotlight on this kind of Korean wave of the past decade that the Chinese have called Hallyu.
Okay, go on then. What else should we know about South Korea and how it's coming for our culture?
Well, it's effectively exploded on the world's cultural stage over the past 10 years, mainly in the form of K-pop or Korean pop music, with this stratospheric rise of these bands like BTS and Blackpink, for example. And then obviously K-dramas like Squid Game have been enormously popular, first in Asia and then over the rest of the world, and mass market fiction. And then, of course, K-beauty, which is Korean beauty products and makeup and skincare in particular, is a multi-billion-dollar market now. And food is another big one. I mean, kimchi is one of their biggest exports globally, so it's kind of 10 years.
They got me with that and the K-pop in the last decade.
Yeah, 10 years of just Korean culture and food and literature and art.
You've not done the skincare yet, Ollie. You should get the Korean, there's like a snail serum. It's really great.
Well,
is it 10 years younger?
Serious question. I sort of imagined that Korean beauty products weren't for white skin. It's all about making Korean skin glow, isn't it?
Look at this.
Are you wearing Korean beauty products?
I'm wearing Korean beauty products right now, mate. Yeah.
Okay.
It's amazing.
Fine. Felicity, I don't know what to say. Good for you. It's interesting.
Yeah,
it is interesting.
It's okay.
Yes.
Is it slightly disproportionate, Felicity, actually, for South Korea as a country? I mean, I suppose it's a bit like Japan in the 80s and 90s dominating technology, isn't it? Consumer technology. South Korea seems to have an influence above and beyond its size and its international influence otherwise.
Yeah, South Korea was very poor for a while and was also under military rule. And then all of a sudden they kind of came out of that. And I think there's a kind of like argument that it's not just sort of an organic cultural rise, that it's also like top down as well, that they've had governments who have seen the success of of the US being able to export its culture, and decided to try and do the same, and they've done that obviously very effectively. And I think what's so uniquely interesting about South Korea is that it obviously borders North Korea, and apparently on the border they play music over to each other in a obviously very aggressive way. And North Korea will play these like military songs about making the ultimate sacrifice for their leader, and South Korea responds by playing K-pop. And it's really taken, like there's some really horrible, like dark, sinister stories about North Koreans being murdered for having South Korean CDs on them. So it's quite dark. Right. But I think South Korea is like, well, if we can invade North Korea with our culture, why stop there? We can take it all over the world, which is basically what they've done. My theory about why South Korean culture is so popular, which I know you're all desperate to hear, is that South Korea is kind of the canary in the coal mine country. Like I feel South Korea is grappling with quite a lot of dark, late-stage capitalism nightmare scenarios, low birth rates, long working hours, focus on productivity and perfectionism and, lots of commercialization, all that sort of thing. And that dystopian nightmare that I feel they're sort of living through IRL, is really fascinating and works in cultural things like Squid Game and Parasite, but it's also, I sort of feel like it's coming for us. And so therefore we're like uniquely fascinated with South Korea and what they're living through at the moment.
Actually, just yesterday, South Korea has suspended loudspeaker propaganda broadcasts across the border to North Korea as part of a bid to, quote, restore trust between both countries. There's a dark side as well, Harriet, in the culture itself, isn't there? Which is the K-pop bands, basically, I mean, to put it crudely, they dance so well because they've been through this sort of mad military intervention from the age of sort of 9. They're hot-housed in how to sing and dance. And there are standards of working with underage people that are different in the West.
Well, it's not a military system.
Military style.
Just be
military style.
Very careful here.
Drilled.
It's a trainee system where young talent goes through intensive training that lasts months or even years before a debut. And we have some very similar structures here in the UK. So let's be very careful about throwing around aspersions there. But in terms of the culture, the dark side of this is obviously the incredibly intense, borderline relentless tabloid culture that they have in South Korea, the digital media culture, the intense speculation about K-pop stars in particular, but just generally their film and TV stars as well, and incredibly aggressively judgmental, particularly about their private lives. It's very harsh and it's so unforgiving. Okay,
that does sound like the UK. So what's different? What do they do?
In terms of the culture, being that it is an incredibly, actually very traditional and very, very, very gender unequal culture, particularly the young female stars come under an astonishing glare in terms of their relationships. But there's also another element, the kind of parasocial element, the intense relationship that fans have with their K-pop stars. It's almost as though they see it as some kind of betrayal that that person might be dating another person. Like K-pop stars have been sort of forced to like apologize for having relationships or dating or whatever, as though it were some kind of betrayal to the relationship they have with their fans. So it's kind of half like parasocial online culture and then half like incredibly regressive, divided society.
It's sort of weirdly, Jamie, similar to what we were saying with regard to the ball of football at the beginning, isn't it? In the sense of, you get all these huge groups and there's boy bands with 20 members and stuff. But it is about the listeners' and viewers' interactivity with individuals on that team, which is making it really fly. They feel like they know these people.
I think that's what Felicity was saying about the canary in the coal mine thing, is that the parasocial relationships that they have with their celebrities is something that's coming over here really quickly. There's a guy called Chris Arnade who writes a Substack that I would really recommend people subscribe to, where he goes on walks but in different countries and talks about the day-to-day lives of people that live in different countries. And his thing about Seoul and South Korea in general is that actually the kind of monocultureness of it makes the culture feel quite thin. And he gives an example of, he was there in 1999 and he was very obsessed with tea. And it was obviously like a very traditional thing in South Korea that they would make tea at home, but he couldn't find a tea shop around, and he asked his kind of assistant that was there, who was South Korean, and he was like, "Oh, we've moved over to coffee now," and that was the only thing that they had with coffee shops. And he was like, "Who do you mean by we?" And he just means, well, South Korea. like South Korea's moved over to coffee now. And that kind of like, we just take over and we work as a whole society, I think makes it quite hollow. And certainly his experience there is that it's kind of hyper stylized, very manufactured, and does feel a little unreal, I guess, being in Seoul.
But I think we're dwelling on the negatives quite a lot here. So just going back to the positives in terms of, for example, the first Nobel Prize for Literature for a Korean woman last year, there was a very interesting strand of commentary about how, particularly for women writing in South Korea, it's become kind of a form of feminist rebellion, and just how against the odds her win the Nobel Prize was. And in the musical that we've been talking about in particular was such a defiance of all the odds. It was such a small original musical up against these massive behemoths with incredible celebrity power and big money behind them and big bankable
maybe Happy
IPs.
Ending did have Darren Criss in it, didn't it? He was quite
but compared with like Nicole Scherzinger, for example, who was up in for Sunset Boulevard. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's no comparison in terms of the money. Like, this was such an underdog. To be nominated for 10 Tonys and to win 6 was such an incredible, incredible achievement. I think we're just skipping over some of the appeal. I mean, for example, last year in the world, 9 out of 10 of the best-selling albums were by South Korean artists. That shows that there is an appeal. Like, it shows that people do love what's coming out in terms of K-drama, K-pop, Korean food, Korean beauty products.
That might also be because the alternative's not very good. I mean, like, look at films at the moment, like 8 Mission Impossibles. Why on earth are we need 8 Mission Impossibles? Like, I sort of feel like...
To take Parasite as an example, when it won the first Oscar for Best Picture for a foreign film in 2020, that was such a huge moment. That is not saying that everything else was bad. That is saying that Parasite was astonishing.
Well, in both cases, Felicity, it sort of speaks maybe to what you were saying about late-stage capitalism, doesn't it? In the sense that maybe Happy Ending, we should just say the story about it is it's about 2 robots who fall in love, 2 robots that have been discarded because technology has moved on. They've been discarded by humanity, they're no longer needed, and then they make a connection with each other. That concept feels very now, and maybe it's a concept that comes out of Korean culture because they're just a bit ahead on some of the ways that people interact with technology, and we're ready for it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not in any way sort of saying that their cultural output isn't really, really good. I just think that they're way ahead because of the society the huge upheavals they're living through in their society. But also another factor might be that what we're producing, or what, you know, Hollywood's producing, is not very good at the moment either.
I also think that it's a real good example of soft power, right? And there's a big focus by the South Korean government on the appeal of cultural export in order to put South Korea on the map and get more tourism to the country. And we only have to see this week, you know, with the spending review in the UK, the way that the cuts have fallen on British soft power in terms of the BBC World Service and the British Council, to see that we don't seem to be going along in the same vein as South Korea.
That's a really fair point, that actually, like, what's so bad about top-down investment in culture? Like, the arts sector in the UK has suffered catastrophic cuts in the last 10 years in particular. And we punch so far above our weight in terms of, in particular, musical theatre, but music more broadly in the UK. More people come to see a West End show in the UK than they do any Premier League football match in a year. So it's an astonishing source of soft power. And South Korea's Hallyu is worth like $12.3 billion a year. So it's also a big source of money. It does make sense to invest in what you're good at. But in terms of the takeaway here, that it is true that this big push for cultural recognition abroad is so tied into just how tumultuous its history has been over the last couple of decades, coming out of war, the division of the peninsula, a military dictatorship, a nascent democracy that's been so under threat last year. There is a tension between trying to project this image of yourself abroad as modern and progressive and fun and cute and K-pop and artistic, and then suffering so much division at home.
Okay, I think like a bowl of fermented cabbage, we have stewed on this too long, so I'm going to end it there. Kimchi burp. Mints don't work. My thanks to Harriet Marsden, Jamie Timson and Felicity Capon. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.